Welcome back to Explore Redundant Epistemology, the most ontologically superfluous podcast on the internet, coming to you live from the Nutty Pine Room of the Hotel Eisenhower at the corner of Wannabe and Has-Been in downtown Pensacola, Florida, where none of the women are attractive and all of the children are below average. And now, here's your host, Mr. Epistemology himself, Randolph Pitts. What is a memory? According to Rudolf Carnap, Homo sapiens sapientia is grounded in our ability to retain memories based on sensory input, and from these memories an indexing file of patterns gradually develops. These patterns become the concepts that enable us not only to navigate the world, but also to learn preferences which guide our choices. This is hot, this will burn. This is honey, it will taste sweet. These preferences become opinions, and those opinions become judgments and standards, both moral and aesthetic. Of course, when Homo sapiens began to speak and the social process of the invention of language commenced, in order to function in his or her community, each person needed to learn to make an association between the concept word, hot, sweet, pretty, and the concept that had already been formed non-verbally in his or her mind. Sometimes there is a disparity. For the most part, each Homo sapiens learns that his or her social adaptivity and acceptability increase to the extent that he or she internalizes concepts, judgments, and values inherent in the language of his or her community. Here we enter the realm of Wittgenstein's forms of life, only viewed perhaps from a different perspective, one from which language is seen as equally enabling and disabling both to perception and to thought. Nevertheless, we agree that if a lion could talk, we would not understand him. Our only observation that being, when all is said and done, the lion understands us better than we understand the lion. Needless to say, this is very much in contrast, and Carnap was certainly aware of this, to the idea that concepts are not formed by observation and experience as we grow and learn, but rather pre-exist in the mind of God. And also, needless to say, this is in contrast with Carl Jung's and writers subsequent to him's notion of the collective unconscious, archetypes, and so forth. But what is a memory? To begin with, the brain has a number of tracks to deal with, as in film or video editing, but much more complex. There are tracks from all the senses, including not only the obvious ones, but also others not overtly relevant, but nevertheless vital to the experience. Your ass itching during a concert, your leg falling asleep during your graduation. Then there are tracks for the verbal narrative the mind produces during all experience, the tracks that meditation attempts to suppress. We say tracks because there is not only your conscious thought process narrating the experience, but also your subconscious and unconscious minds parallel and usually repressed subtext, plus additional verbal tracks for the imagined thoughts of others, their judgments and opinions, their approval or disapproval. Then there are associative memory tracks, since each moment in the now, even as it itself is being recorded as a new memory, conjures up memories from the past. And finally, or maybe not, there may be more, there are future memory tracks, as the mind, again, even as it experiences the present and lays it down as a memory, is generating its own vision of what the next moment or minute or hour or lifetime will bring. The verbal tracks then take note, either consciously or unconsciously, of discrepancies between the remembered past, the present as it is being recorded in memory, and the imagined future. With so many tracks, this would be a nightmare as a video editing project, and even, I dare say, as an audio recording project. Yet somehow, Clearly, some of this data makes its way from RAM, present consciousness, into the deep storage that we call memory. The question is then how the brain edits the tracks, then files and stores the data. To be more precise, what we are really asking is, on what basis does the brain make its editing, redacting, or distorting, and storage decisions? We read a long time ago studies which purported to demonstrate that the brain makes these decisions based on pleasure. That is to say, that the mind is more likely to retain a good, complete, and long-lasting memory if the tracks, sensory data, and all the rest are accompanied by pleasant affect rather than by negative or presumably neutral affect. This does not necessarily seem wrong to us, and in a certain way it is not unrelated to Freud's concept of dreams as wish fulfillment, provided that we take into account his ideas about displacement and condensation and their impact on which memories are retained, and also Jacques Lacan's key notion that the unconscious is structured like a language, so that what we believe that we remember may be, by the process of metonymy, displacement, and or condensation, metaphor, a stand-in for the actual data, which has been repressed and transformed into something else, something less ego-dystonic. Subject to all of the above, it appears that the brain may store much more detailed and older memory material than we are aware of in our conscious lives, the evidence for this being hypnotism and perhaps also sodium pentothal. If this is indeed the case, the brain's compression algorithm for storing memory data, the various parallel tracks roughly delineated above, may be much better than its decompression algorithm. And/or, probably it's the pleasure factor, again, which plays a key role. The pleasure of an experience may not so much positively correlate with how well we remember it, how much of a given experience ends up being stored in non-volatile, long-term memory, on a hard disk, so to speak, but rather how readily we can retrieve the stored memory file from that non-volatile memory. Pleasant memories are those which we do not repress, and therefore we can retrieve them more readily. But still, under hypnosis, the pleasure factor is reduced, and there is access to, i.e., ability to retrieve, much more material than the conscious mind is aware of having stored. We require at this point a divagation and exegesis which will focus explicitly on the role of memory in psychodynamic psychology. For this, we are indebted in part for a discussion by Dr. Werner Bohleber as presented in his keynote address at the International Psychoanalytic Association's 45th Congress in Berlin in July of 2007. Freud constantly regarded it as the goal of the analytic treatment to bring repressed memories of early psychic life to consciousness. One reason for this is to be found in his theory of memory. According to Freud, perceptions are stored in the memory as memory traces. They are certainly copies of the original impression, but they are not preserved as isolated elements as they would be in a primitive engram theory. In Freud's view, there are several superimposed systems of memory that order the same memory trace, which is stored several times in duplicate according to specific principles. The first memory system associates the elements using the principle of simultaneity in time. Subordinate systems represent them according to other forms of occurrence, such as relationships of similarity or something associated by contiguity. Memories of past impressions and experiences can, in principle, be retrieved intact. This is not, in fact, generally the case, because of unconscious wishes connected with the elements of memory which lead to its displacements and repressions. The reemergence of memories is then connected with the destiny of the drive wishes. The authenticity of the childhood scene and its reconstruction is significant for Freud insofar as only the analysis of the processes that distort them brings to light the unconscious wish. I insert a brief comment that it is, of course, bringing to light the unconscious wish which is vital in treatment. In Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through, Freud describes filling in gaps in memory by overcoming the resistances to repression as the goal of the analytic treatment. The patient has to remember specific experiences and the affective impulses that they evoke, because it is only in this way that he is to be convinced that what appears to be reality is in fact a reflection of a forgotten past. It is not the events or facts in themselves that are remembered, but their psychic processing. Freud refers very generally to, quote, psychic events, unquote, such as the patient's childhood defiance toward his parents' authority. For him, the historical truth of memories also consists precisely in this, rather than only in an accurate reproduction of objective facts. Freud celebrates it as a triumph for the treatment if he can bring it about that something the patient wishes to discharge in action is disposed of through the work of remembering. This does not always succeed because forgotten and repressed material is frequently repeated as an act rather than being reproduced as a memory. The repetition compulsion takes over here from the urge to remember, and the transference becomes its arena. Its interpretation then leads to the awakening of the memories which appear without difficulty, as it were, after the resistance has been overcome. Freud, as he writes in Constructions and Analysis, later became more cautious with regard to awakening memories. We are indeed seeking, quote, a picture of the patient's forgotten years that shall be alike trustworthy and in all essential respects complete, but in some cases it is impossible to go beyond constructions. These certainly produce an upward drive of the repressed that strives to carry the important memory traces into consciousness, but is often obstructed. The process of becoming conscious then extends only as far as the patient's assured conviction of the truth of the construction. Here again quoting Freud. As this return to Freud's theory of memory shows, he regards memories as a revival of the mnemonic residues that are conceived as images of earlier psychic processes. It is only by lifting the repression and working through the conflicts that the past can be reproduced, and this is without any remodeling in consciousness being experienced through the revival. If a memory is reproduced as an act through repetition, it is integrated into a behavioral context with its own meaning in the present. The present, therefore, not only has the function of awakening the memory, and thus the forgotten past material, but it also forces the past psychic occurrence into the present structure of events, shapes it, and thereby transforms its meaning. The past experience is actively incorporated into the context of the current life experience. Freud, therefore, also refers on occasion to a remodeling process that applies to memories. Thus, in a letter of 6 December 1896 to Wilhelm Fliess, Freud says that from time to time memory traces undergo a rearrangement in accordance with fresh circumstances, a retranscription. This retranscription is the psychic achievement of successive stages of life. Thus, in puberty, fantasies developed concerning childhood and memory traces undergo a complicated process of remodeling. These alternative concepts pave the way for a modern understanding of memories as constructions that are influenced by the past. If a memory is reproduced as an act through repetition, it is integrated into a behavioral context with its own meaning in the present. The present, therefore, not only has the function of awakening the memory, and thus the forgotten past material, but it also forces the past psychic occurrence into the present structure of events, shapes it, and thereby transforms its meaning. The past experience is actively incorporated into the context of the current life experience. We need, before we may be allowed to conclude this divagation, to address the sometimes hot topic of false memories. In the following, we have incorporated some material by Melanie Caroline Stephan and Sylvia Meckenbreuer, both of the Friedrich Schiller University Jena II, University of Trier, published in Zeitschrift für Psychologie in 2007. As an introduction to the practical relevance of false memories, think of a woman who has been in therapy for many years because she has difficulties trusting men. She has panic attacks. She has a very distant relationship with her father, and she suffers from disturbing nightmares. At some point during that therapy, she recovers faint memories of early childhood abuse by her father. She consequently breaks off all contact with her family of origin. Can we be sure that she truly recovered old memories as opposed to reconstructing memories that are in line with her current beliefs and feelings? The self-help literature for victims of abuse is very clear. For instance, quote, "You must believe that your client was sexually abused even if she herself sometimes doubts it. No one invents abuse. But what do experts on memory say? Can faint memories of early childhood be false memories due to suggestions? How can such memories be induced? And how can theories of memory explain this? Finally, what are the practical implications for situations such as that in the above example of the woman in therapy? A few years ago, the memory wars split psychology into therapists believing in their clients' reports and researchers inquiring skeptically the validity of such reports. In the popular press book, The Myth of Repressed Memory, Elizabeth Loftus, co-author with Catherine Ketchum of the book The Myth of Repressed Memories, False Memories and Allegations of Sexual Abuse, wrote, "Something has gone wrong with therapy, and because that something has to do with memory, I find myself at the center of an increasingly bitter and fractious controversy. On the one side are the true believers who insist that the mind is capable of repressing memories. Those whom she calls, not too flatteringly, the true believers, were so outraged by the decisiveness with which she questioned the existence of recovered memories that they sent her incredibly fierce letters. Please consider your work to be on the same level as those who deny the existence of the extermination camps during World War II." It seems that by now some of the steam has cooled down, and the not very original answer probably lies in the middle. Memory theories predict and findings prove that memories, even if held confidently, may be false. Memory theories have always predicted, and older as well as newer findings show, that things that once appeared forgotten can't possibly be recovered under other circumstances. William James wrote, "Memory is then the feeling of belief in a peculiar complex object. The re-recollected past and the imaginary past may be much the same. There is nothing unique in the object of memory." Unquote. The element left out by James is that of repression. I'm going to use that expression here broadly and not technically by stating that we tend to repress in the sense of deliberately forgetting, filing away in some backup drive we had no intention of accessing, and even have protected by a password we intend to forget, events and even, perhaps especially, longings and desires which are ego-dystonic. In other words, which are not in tune with our ego, not supportive of the self-image we are comfortable with, the self-image which allows us to function. However, and it is a big however, those repressed events, longings, and desires still have a nasty way of returning in neurotic behaviors. And I mean here, even in behaviors that either hold us back in expressing ourselves in attempting to fulfill our desires, or are in fact self-damaging in other ways. One might even ask if sublimation itself is not, in essence, neurotic. However, such speculation is beyond the range of this episode. A title appeared in front of me this morning which read, "Dark Matter Doesn't Exist," which begs the question, what is existence? Since this podcast is entitled Explore Redundant Epistemology, the most ontologically superfluous podcast on the internet, we are not allowed to leave the issue of existence alone. Martin Heidegger's Being and Time explicitly rejects Descartes' notion of the human being as a subjective spectator of events. Instead, he claims that ordinary and even mundane being in the world provides access to the meaning or sense of being, Sinn des Seins. Sinn des Seins. This access via Dasein is also that in terms of which something becomes intelligible as something. In a letter to Ernst Junger in 1956, Heidegger began with the word being crossed out, then continued, since the word is inaccurate, it is crossed out. Since it is necessary, it is left legible. To summarize Heidegger simplistically, and no one would have loathed being summarized simplistically more than Marty Heidegger, Dasein makes things intelligible as something. Our being in the world gives access to meaning and thus makes things intelligible. Is that brilliant, or is that just rigmarole with words? Well, he was kind of at the root of existentialism and such, and all those wonderful people we love. Life forms on Earth, and possibly anywhere else they may exist in one form or another, including us, are so temporary, scarcely a blip in the greater scheme of things, and not even that. So by what definition do we exist? We really do not, you know. A consciousness existing in a broader, longer mode of time would not notice us at all. Are life forms on Earth, including us, intelligible to other forms of consciousness that may, as just stated, exist? We are scarcely intelligible to one another, after all, Marty Heidegger notwithstanding. In the Compendium Theologiae, Thomas Aquinas wrote, "The higher an intellectual substance is in perfection, the more universal are the intelligible forms it possesses. Of all the intellectual substances, consequently, the human intellect, which we have called possible, has forms of the least universality. This is the reason it receives its intelligible forms from sensible things." Going back a little bit to Rudolf Carnap, but not exactly. He further states that a form must have some proportion to the potency which receives it. Therefore, since of all intellectual substances man's possible intellect is found to be the closest to corporeal matter, its intelligible forms must likewise be most closely allied to material things. Aha! From one perspective, this is typical Platonism, which we have denounced in this podcast since our very first episode. From another perspective, another level or stratum of consciousness vastly different in time may have no attention span for corporeal matter, insofar as it is living and thus temporary, ephemeral. Stated differently, it is only life's constituent substances, carbon to begin with, which are perceived and thus intelligible, and certainly not any mental processes, except insofar as they involve chemicals and perhaps energy, electricity, one might call it. We have expressed elsewhere that different life forms extant at present on this planet may, and indeed do, have a different time frame than ours. Thus, do elephants sense the approach of a tsunami through their heightened senses, or do they have a different experience of time, one that allows them to see forward as well as experience the present in the present and remember backwards? For Hamlet, the only time is his own time, and there is also but one time, the moment of his downfall. The entire tragedy consists in showing us Hamlet's implacable progress toward that hour. Jacques Lacan, Seminar 6, Desire and its Interpretation. One of the most distinctive features of Lacanian psychoanalysis is Lacan's approach to questions of time. Broadly speaking, Lacan's approach is characterized by two important innovations: the concept of logical time and the stress on retroaction and anticipation. In his paper entitled Logical Time, dated 1945, Lacan undermines the pretensions of logic to timelessness and eternity by showing how logical calculations include an inescapable reference to temporality. However, the kind of temporality involved is not specifiable by reference to the clock, but is itself the product of certain logical articulations. This distinction between logical time and chronological time underpins Lacan's whole theory of temporality, which in fact has a tripartite structure. The fact that logical time is not objective does not mean that it is simply a question of subjective feeling. On the contrary, as the adjective logical indicates, it is a precise dialectical structure which may be formulated rigorously in mathematical terms. In the 1945 paper, Lacan argues that logical time has a tripartite structure, the three moments of which are the instant of seeing, the time for understanding, the moment of concluding. By means of a sophism, the problem of the three prisoners, Lacan shows how these three moments are constructed not in terms of objective chronometric units, but in terms of an intersubjective logic based on a tension between waiting and haste, between hesitation and urgency. Logical time is thus the intersubjective time that structures human action. Lacan's term après coup is the term used by French analysts to translate Freud's Nachträglichkeit, deferred action. These terms refer to the way that, in the psyche, present events affect past events a posteriori, since the past exists in the psyche only as a set of memories which are constantly being reworked and reinterpreted in the light of present experience. What concerns psychoanalysis is not the real past sequence of events in themselves, but the way that these events exist now in memory and the way that the patient reports them. Thus, when Lacan argues that the aim of psychoanalytic treatment is, quote, the complete reconstitution of the subject's history, he makes it clear that what he means by the term history is not simply a real sequence of past events, but the present synthesis of the past. If retroaction refers to the way the present affects the past, anticipation refers to the way the future affects the present. Like retroaction, Anticipation marks the structure of speech. The first words of a sentence are ordered in anticipation of the words to come. In the mirror stage, the ego is constructed on the basis of the anticipation of an imagined future wholeness, which never, in fact, arrives. The structure of anticipation is best illustrated linguistically by the future perfect tense. Anticipation also plays an important role in the tripartite structure of logical time. The moment of concluding, quote, is arrived at in haste in anticipation of future certainty, unquote. For purposes of the following elaboration of Jacques Lacan's concept of time, we shall be relying in part on subjectivity in between times, an exploration of the notion of time in Jacques Lacan's work, a thesis submitted in 2018 for the degree of Ph.D. Psychosocial Studies at Birkbeck College, University of London, by Chen-Yang Wang. Noted French psychoanalyst Philippe Refabert, and author of the book From Freud to Kafka, The Paradoxical Foundation of the Life and Death Instinct, points out that defining the origin of sexuality in terms of the Oedipus story, quote, makes the sexual a given, something natural, in short, a substance. It is inborn sexuality, rather than the Oedipus complex, that takes the place of seduction, as in Freud's seduction theory, as mentioned a moment or so ago, and becomes the starting point of the individual's psychosexual development. Yet, the origin of the traumatic nature of sexuality remains unexplained. In the Oedipus complex, the frustration one experiences when one's attachment to the desired object cannot be realized is inherent to the essential prematurity of the drives. The original specific prematurity at birth as a biological phenomenon is doubled by another form of prematurity. While the human organism is premature in relation to the environment, the psychological mastery of the body through ego formation is also premature. To quote Lacan, the sight alone of the whole form of the human body gives the subject an imaginary mastery over his body, one which is premature in relation to real mastery. That is such an important statement that I'm going to read it again. The sight alone of the whole form of the human body gives the subject, the individual, the person, an imaginary mastery over his body, one which is premature in relation to a real mastery. Wang argues that the notion of prematuration perfectly explains this definition by bringing together two different but essential temporal registers of the human being in Lacan's theory. One is real time, in which the human body is always in the process of becoming because of biological inadequacy. The other is symbolic time, in which the subject is always already presupposed before the physiological maturation is completed in order to enable its own formation. In response to the central temporal paradox in the Freud rank debate, the fundamental desynchrony between the biological origin and the symbolic origin of the subject, Lacan refuses to choose either along a linear timeline. Instead, he points out that this temporal desynchrony, or the splitting of the timeline, is the actual original mechanism that shapes the subjective structure in which the origin as a single moment is projected into the past as something that comes too early is too premature. At the root of Lacan's thinking, we find that the temporal condition of subjectivity is redefined in the horizon of the present. While the Freudian account of the origin, that is, the origin of sexuality, is based on a linear notion of time as trapped largely, if not exclusively, in the past, Lacan argues that the origin of the present can only be revealed in the present itself. To repeat, Lacan argues that the origin of the present can only be revealed in the present itself. In Seminar 2, Lacan has a discussion of this common mistake in one's quest for the origin. When something comes to light, something which we are forced to consider as new, when another structural order emerges, well then, it creates its own perspective within the past, and we say, this can never not have been there, this has existed from the beginning. Besides, isn't that a property which our own experience demonstrates? The subjective temporal experience is fundamentally an experience of difference when the subject engages with something present in various instances of the now. However, because of the symbolic universe as a field of meaning which precedes the subject, what appears to be new thus always seems to extend itself indefinitely into perpetuity, prior to itself. Again quoting Lacan, this is key. What appears to be new thus always seems to extend itself indefinitely into perpetuity, prior to itself. Permit me to observe that this strikes us as a profound insight into how we experience temporality, and especially, as Lacan states, of what appears to be new. Insofar as the origin is understood as a past event that acts at a distance upon the present one, assigned a fixed place in the sequence of instances that can be arranged linearly, difference is reduced to repetition. What appears to be new is disguised in the form of a consequence in regard to the representation of the past. The dilemma is that while the ontological bearing of the present requires the origin, the Freudian origin itself eliminates the present. By taking prematuration as the origin that is contemporaneous with the present, yet conditions the very experience of lack which causes the present to pass, Lacan's origin becomes an a priori horizon for the possibilities of being to manifest themselves in the present and thereby embraces changes that are contained in the moment of the now. Again, we must insert a question. Is it indeed the very experience of lack which causes the present to pass? Does the present evanesce because something is missing? Because it is missing something which the future will bring? Which the future will hopefully bring? Is experience of the present fundamentally an experience of lack? In order to further comprehend the decisive significance of the idea of dual temporality in Lacan's theorization of subject formation, we ought to have another look at his analysis of primal repression, which in Lacan's reading is the fundamental mechanism that essentially determines the unconscious. In Freudian metapsychology, primal repression is a difficult concept that has not been given sufficient elaboration in his subsequent writings. In Lacan's reading, primal repression is not a moment of integration when the embodiment of the other's desire becomes a part of one's own, but rather a moment of disintegration. For the final section of this divagation on the subject of Jacques Lacan, time and memory, we're going to rely in part or refer in part to a certain article, piece of writing, by one Sharon Green entitled Nachträglichkeit, Shame and Ethical Time. Sharon Green has a private practice of psychoanalysis and clinical consultation in Seattle, Washington. She is a member of the International Association of Analytical Psychology, which means Jung. Okay, well, we're going to share some thoughts that she has with you anyway. Although we often think of fate in terms of being its victim, fate can also mean the will or determining cause by which things come to be as they are. This brings us, albeit momentarily, to a mention of the expression amor fati, used by Friedrich Nietzsche, and we refer here in part to an article entitled How Amor Fati Became Nietzsche's Formula for Learning to Love Necessity and Human Thriving by one Sven Gellens, Ghent University Department of German Literature, Ghent, Belgium. Nietzsche's hypothesis is that perception is structured at the foundational level by experiences of pleasure and unpleasure, Lust und Unlust. This is certainly in line with how we have discussed memory and what one remembers in this podcast. Professor Gellens says that for some reason, which Nietzsche does not disclose, living organisms started to associate pleasure and displeasure with stimuli. But for us, this seems quite needless of any explanation. Love, properly employed through scientific reasoning, is able to temper man's habit of valuating. In Menschliches, allzu Menschliches, ein Buch für freie Geister. Nietzsche describes the method, Verfahren, of using love as an artifice, Liebe als Kunstgriff, as the aphorism is entitled, and more specifically, an artifice of reason. Josephine Naukoff correctly translates the concept amor fati as love of one's fate, adding one's in parenthesis and thus demonstrating the synonymy of the individual's fate and fate in general. In reality, every man is himself a piece of fate. When he thinks to resist fate in the way suggested, it is precisely fate that is here fulfilling itself. The struggle is imaginary. But so is the proposed resignation to fate. All these imaginings are encircled within fate. The follies of mankind are just as much a piece of fate as are its acts of intelligence. That fear in face of a belief in fate is also fate. You yourself, poor fearful man, are the implacable Mora, enthroned even above the gods that govern all that happens. You are the blessing or the curse, and in any event, the fetters in which the strongest lies captive. In you, the whole future of the world of men is predetermined. It is no use for you to shudder when you look upon yourself. The ending of this aphorism is remarkable. How can an individual's fate be understood as a predetermination of the whole future of the world of man? In dir ist alle Zukunft der Menschenwelt vorherbestimmt. Individuals can become perspective to human greatness when they accept this Vatum and explore the configurations of their body and the judgments that correspond to these. This acceptance is what Nietzsche calls love of one's fate, amor fati. To quote Nietzsche again, my formula for human greatness is amor fati, that you do not want anything to be different, not forwards, not backwards, not for all eternity, not just to tolerate necessity, still less to conceal it. All idealism is hypocrisy toward necessity, but to love it. Amor fati is not about inflating oneself to cosmic proportions as a means to transcend all oppositions. Rather, it is about breeding oneself to become who you are. It is concerned with self-experimentation and therefore links up perfectly with Nietzsche's appeal to consider life as an experiment for the knowledge seeker. Now let us return to Lacan and compare Nietzsche's ideas with his. Lacanian psychoanalysis assumes that we ourselves are fate and that through a paradoxical twisting of time, we can become the cause of our own lives. This is possible because of Nachträglichkeit, a psychic dynamic in which memories are in constant temporal flux, with meaning always deferred until some indefinite future with no final ground or presence. Nachträglichkeit interweaves past, present, and future in a way that allows us to assume responsibility not only for present and future actions, but also for past actions, whether consciously or unconsciously intended. For Lacan, temporality is thus intimately related to the repressed and unconscious aspects of our singular history, to the structures of language, and to our lifetime struggle to make meaning from non-meaning, sense from nonsense. One of the goals of Lacanian psychoanalysis is to arrive at the disturbing realization that there is no final meaning to our speech, our memories, or our lives, because there is no final authority, be it God or ultimate truth or science, that anchors meaning. Rather, Nachträglichkeit reflects time as a vehicle for a perpetual process of transformation wherein we come to be who we will have been. In order for these processes of transformation to occur, we must be able to bear the shame of our constitutional lack, the void of non-meaning around which we are constituted. Otherwise we risk becoming frozen in sterile repetitions, or we disavow our shame and act immodestly without regard for the impact we have on others. Assuming responsibility for our hidden desires, our unintended actions, and most importantly, for our own inevitable unconsciousness, while bearing the shame of our constitutional lack, are the intertwined dimensions of what Ms. Green was calling ethical time, the time that resonates throughout Lacan's work. For Heidegger, and so for Lacan, the human being does not exist in time, but exists as temporality. Temporality is not an entity, a sequence of self-contained nows, moving from future to present to past in linear succession, but is a self-generating and self-transcending process. It is the distinctively human capacity to be at once ahead, behind, and alongside oneself. Past, present, and future reflects the three dimensions of lived time that relate to each other in a circular movement. Heidegger calls these dimensions the three ecstasies to emphasize the specific ways in which we stand outside of ourselves as Dasein, i.e., as temporal human beings. By being able to distance myself from myself in time, via memories of the past or anticipation of the future, we are freed from a merely biological life of immediacy dominated by continuous bodily need and gratification. In other words, for both Heidegger and Lacan, we are radically alienated, i.e., other than ourselves, in time, allowing us to be different from our past selves by standing outside of ourselves while looking backwards and forwards. This means we can live our lives informed by the context of our unique history while looking towards an undetermined future. Because we know that we will die, Heidegger says that death precedes us, making Dasein the ordinary phenomenon of the future. The deceased is finally at peace or at rest. For Lacan, we never arrive at a final destination or fixed identity because we are lacking, and our lack sets up the movement of infinite desiring. As Lacan writes, the function of desire must remain in a fundamental relationship to death. Shouldn't the true termination of an analysis confront the one who undergoes it with the reality of the human condition, namely Hilflosigkeit, or distress, the state in which man is in that relationship to himself, which is his own death, and can expect help from no one. Hilflosigkeit, helplessness. Lacan describes the subject of the unconscious as an aphanesis, of fading away, because as soon as it emerges at this impossible point between pulsation and object, it disappears under the signifier it has assumed. Just as a slip of the tongue, a bungled action, or a symptom are the leftover evidence of unconscious processes, the subject is also a symptom of unconscious processes and the dynamic of Nachträglichkeit. The subject is only as negativity. Lacan, who was influenced by Sartre, recognized that our lack of determinable essence is our freedom. Let me repeat that because it is very important. Our lack of determinable essence is our freedom. We are always becoming and have no substantial essence. Like the infinitely deferred meaning in a sentence, the meaning of who we are is also in constant flux and infinitely deferred. It's like sentences in German, where you wait for the verb to come finally after an entire paragraph. And thus back to other matters not related explicitly to Lacan. Since I wrote the above several years ago, I have had some additional thoughts which I am going to insert now as a brief divagation. As we experience life and its various phenomena, mental, tangible, visible, etc., through our senses and otherwise, we are constantly making value judgments based on the standards of society. I mentioned that in a different way already. This can give rise to a number of different things. One of those things is that we are constantly judging ourselves with respect to the experiences that we have. We are looking at our behavior as we behave and the opportunities that confront us and the situations we are in, and asking ourselves the extent to which these are what the Freudians would call ego-syntonic, that is to say, in tune with the ego, and which of these experiences are ego-dystonic, that is, which are challenging to the ego in one way or another. There is also the issue of moral judgments that the superego and outside forces are constantly encouraging us to make. One of the things that inevitably comes up is the feeling of guilt on the one hand and shame on the other. For what should one feel guilty in one's behavior or in one's judgments? For what should one feel shame in one's behavior or in one's judgment? What does our so-called self-esteem hang on? On what does it rely as we move through life? Then there are issues specifically related to certain modes of behavior. One example would be, for example, sex. Materials available to us and experiences shared by people we know with us often relate to sex and sexual experiences and what one's expectations should be and what one's reactions should be, what one's evaluations should be. Was I a good lover, quote unquote, in this particular experience, to put it simplistically? Did I hurt someone in this sexual experience? Again, the judgment is being made in our mind concurrently with the behavior and also retroactively in our memory. What does it mean when we say, I had a good memory of that time we spent in Pacoima? What does it mean when I say I had a bad memory of the time we spent in Saint-Tropez? Pacoima, California, and Saint-Tropez, France, being about the two most opposite places one could possibly think of. In general, in the opinion of this podcast, guilt is not such a good thing to be weighed down under. It is not a good thing to be punishing oneself all the time, to look back at one's memories and have regrets, unless one has seriously harmed someone, unless one has seriously inhibited another person's ability to find self-fulfillment. Guilt is not a good frame of mind. Our sponsor, Jacques Lacan, wrote as follows: "History is not the past. History is the past insofar as it is historicized in the present. Historicized in the present because it was lived in the past." Which begs the question, what is the present? Is historicizing a means of retrocausality? Can we change the present by changing the past? History here is cultural/societal memory, which invariably diverges from individuals' memories. Was there ever life, in quotes, in the past? Or is there only life in the moment? So we take just this brief moment to talk about the difference between cultural societal memory and individual memory. We live in this context of cultural societal memory, just as some of us live in the context of relationship memories with our families or with our loved ones, to the extent that we are fortunate enough to have a marital or intimate partner. Some of us are, some of us are not. This is the soup in which we swim or sink, as the case may be. History, as Lacan perhaps meant it, and as others do, is something that we are taught. One studies history in school. We are told what happened in the past, and we are told what its significance is for the present. Famous quotes include, "Past is prologue." I don't even know where that's from, and I basically don't care. "Those who cannot remember the past will screw up the present." That's someone else who said that. Societal memory, history, is used to manipulate us, to manipulate our behavior in the present, to tell us what we are in danger of doing to mess things up, to tell us the limits of what is possible for us to do as individuals, to tell us that if we deviate from what societal, historical memory, history has set out for us, that it is dangerous for us as individuals. Danger, threatening. Ergo, we require, as individuals, a certain escape hatch from societal memory. We require a transformative way of thinking, a creative way of thinking, which allows us to break away and contemplate, if I may say, utopian rather than dystopian ideas about what life and the organization of human life can be without becoming ridiculous or absurd. And yes, there is a danger in becoming ridiculous or absurd. However, Jacques Lacan is not finished with us yet, nor we with him. From Seminar 6, Desire and its Interpretation, we quote, "In an era in which all philosophy has taken the path of articulating what links time with being, Let us not forget that past, present, and future, the constitutive times or tenses of temporality, are those of grammar. The notion that time is mapped only with respect to the act of speaking is quite elementary. The present is the moment at which I am speaking and nothing else. Which circles us back to the whole notion of the mind as continuous narrator of our experience. The mind, at least in one of its tracks, perhaps the most predominant one, is narrating with words what is happening to us. This is an experience which some attempt, and not necessarily foolishly, to bypass with things like psychedelic drugs in the effort to gain a more fundamental sensual experience of their environment, of their so-called reality, without the intervention of language, because language, after all, words, after all, speaking, after all, involves those concepts, whether they're formed internally by our own experience, such as Rudolf Carnap would argue, and we referred to at the very beginning of this episode, or whether they come from somewhere else, from society, the forms of life of Wittgenstein, or from those archetypes of Jung, or from those forms of our good buddy Plato. Let's not join him in the symposium, however, because unless you're interested in particular in talking about the love between men and boys. No need to digress on that topic. Again, Lacan, the present is the moment at which I am speaking and nothing else. So if we cease to be narrating our experience one way or another, either internally or externally to someone else in words, there is no present. There is no moment. Which, in a certain way, might not be such a bad thing.
Est-ce que je m'aime? Vraiment pas. J'aime bien ce que j'ai été hier. Je ne suis jamais en adéquation avec le présent. Aujourd'hui, non, je ne m'aime pas. Mais, quand je regarde des photos d'hier sur lesquelles je ne m'aimais pas, je me dis, ah si, c'était bien. Charlotte Gainsbourg.
Avant, je croyais que tout ce que je vivais, c'était exceptionnel. Et que tout ce que j'allais vivre et faire, ce serait toujours exceptionnel. Maintenant, je me trouve très banale. Il y a des fois où je trouve ça très bien, et il y a des jours où je supporte pas.
Charlotte Gainsbourg.
In the latter half of the 20th century, humanist education, the liberal arts, and even the sciences moved away from the traditional emphasis on memorization as the core of the learning process. This is what the massive protest movement in France in 1968 were all about. The students mobbed the streets, not so much because they believed in socialism or the rights of the workers, but rather because they opposed the antiquated education system which emphasized memorization rather than active thought, and thus critical thought, critical thinking. Humanist educators, meaning most Western educators, realized that human memory was finite in its capacity and ephemeral to various degrees in its longevity. Thus, the emphasis shifted toward teaching the young in such a way that they, as adults, would be capable of making sound, rational judgments and decisions which would benefit both society and themselves, both their employers and their families. A degree in history or English literature or even music or classics was seen as a sound foundation for a career in business, government, or any other form of administration. Indeed, for any career that involved interacting with other people. But no longer. With the concentration of corporate and governmental power and authority, decisions are increasingly made far up the ladder from the rung where the individual resides and functions. Increasingly, individuals perform their occupational tasks on a purely technical level, activating and effectuating policies and designs formulated elsewhere, in a lofty realm far removed from that where the worker exists and does his job. And what does the worker need to perform his function? Much less a moral, social, economic, and historical foundation on the basis of which to form judgments and make decisions, and much more technical knowledge and data. Most of this data is absolutely arbitrary and requires raw memorization on the part of the student. For the most part, there is but scant conceptual framework to serve as a mnemonic trellis or scaffold. It's like learning words in a language where there are few cognates with the one you speak, and without being taught sufficient grammar to discern the syntax, let alone the meaning. Computer commands are a paradigmatic example. There is no sense to them, to what words are used, to how they are spelled, to what order they may be entered in, to the punctuation that must be used, hyphen or no hyphen, colon or no colon. They were decided upon and promulgated as standards by programmers and committees and corporations, and the worker's role is solely to memorize them, and thus to make the equipment and the system work the way the higher powers wish it to. Of course, this applies even to workers at the lowest level, to the supermarket checker, needing to memorize that arbitrary code 5030 is for okra, and 1209 is for radicchio. The economic importance of college degrees is rapidly declining as more and more people discover that such degrees, which reflect a student's achievement in studying, analyzing, and discussing knowledge and creative expression as a fully functioning human being, are less important than passing technical examinations which qualify one for professional certification. And such examinations are based largely on raw memorization of arbitrary data. The next phase of human evolution will not be somatic. It may even be invisible to the physical anthropologists of the future, if there are any, and in accordance with our theory, there may not be. The next phase will be algorithmic evolution. Pleasure will decline in importance as a criterion for the retention of new memories and access to old ones. Since it has irrelevant material, fantasy, desire, the other, object A, love, death, as its subject matter, the unconscious, a relic of the hunter-gatherer and proto-agrarian phases, will atrophy, like the tail among the simians. Meanwhile, both the compression and decompression algorithms will evolve to be much more efficient, and will increasingly favor the retention of raw data with which the eyes and ears are presented, including strings of arbitrary letters and numbers, over the other tracks. A subconscious reaction, bodily affect, even conscious experiential narrative, and certainly over the anticipation of the future tracks, which will decline in significance as human tasks and experience increasingly become rote processes, requiring total concentration on the present. The evolved decompression algorithm will rapidly access compressed data from the long-term non-volatile memory and decompress it in a way that is lossless with respect to what is required for the individual to perform his or her technical function. This will be at the expense of other memories, which, to save both storage space and processing power, will be swept into temporary trash folders and permanently deleted on a regular basis, like malware or viruses, or, more relevantly, temporary internet files. Contrary to current fantasies as reflected in video games, popular films, and television, in the future, man will not create robots to do his work so that he can live in a utopia of pleasure, creation, contemplation, and speculation, or even so that the rich will become richer and the poor will subsist in even more pathetic poverty. Rather, man will become more like a special species of computer. Evolution will favor individuals with the best retrieval decompression systems for data, with best meaning ability to sort non-volatile memory and determine which data is most applicable to a given new situation, based also on a projection into the probable future. We say probable because such projection will be based not on values or history or thoughts or feelings, or even on presumed economic benefit as viewed from the standpoint of the individual, but solely on what has functioned for the system in the past. The probability algorithm will be totally devoid of human factors. Again, the body, fantasy, the other, love, desire, even pain, and even death, either individual, familial, or societal. What is a memory? A crouton in your soup of longing. Your hand on her doorknob, tart metal. Your wrist tightens. You imagine the cold outside, the drone of traffic and humming in the wires. And then her fingers close around yours. Her lips touch your cheek. Her hand brushes your leg. She turns off the light. You taste the Merlot in her mouth. It's overwhelming. You lose your balance, but she catches you. You kiss so long. Her breath tickles your upper lip. You laugh even as your tongue entwines with hers. You're so happy. But somewhere in this memory there was a splice. There were two branches. There was a junction in the trail. So you replay the memory again, this time with the other tracks. The subconscious narrative rises to the surface this time around. You were annoyed with her. She had bored you. The movie she had insisted on watching was jejune at best. Touching her breast through her bra afterwards was insufficient compensation. You had to take a leak, but you were in a hurry to get out of there. You were sick of her giggles, her saccharine and puerile advice, her trinkets and her dog. You wanted to go home, back to other memories which you could re-edit and play back as you pleased. Adopting from the moment another view, we live in memory. There is no present. The author of a book once signed it for me, "Love is in the moment." Perhaps what she meant was that any infatuation you may feel for me is merely a flash, like a flashbulb on an old-fashioned camera for a moment, making the supposed present more visible until that second of infatuation vanishes into the supposed past. I say supposed present and supposed past because time is something we impose and experience for purposes of our own consciousness, of our own sanity. In the greater scheme of things, it doesn't exist. Someone was showing me a photo album last night, scrupulously organized and lovingly maintained, with snapshots of places she and her late husband had visited and stayed in. In relationships, so-called couples have parallel memories, which is in and of itself a curious phenomenon. Someday in the future, we may be able to plug into our lover's mind and see and experience their memories. It will be like viewing another cut of a movie. Not just a cut, but with all different tracks. Shared memories, meaning individual memories of the same things, can enrich and strengthen, if you will, a relationship. However, they are often recalled, summoned again, if you will, in the context of conflict. There are also what I will call, for lack of a better word, imagined memories, since our thoughts are often, perhaps always, accompanied by fantasy. Tom Cruise's fantasies of Nicole Kidman having sex with a young naval officer they had met in the film Eyes Wide Shut is an excellent example. Imagined memories, fantasy memories, harbor fears, doubts and misgiving. Thoughts of things that didn't really happen but might have happened. My mother having drinks with a handsome young guide who had shown us around the Grand Canyon during the day. How late were they out? Was I already asleep when she came back to our hotel room? Had she prepared herself in an especially alluring manner? Or is this my generally dormant Oedipus complex running wild with all kinds of fantasies? Why is it that we often latch on to and expand things that cause us stress? Perhaps this is because stress is exciting. It keeps us on our toes, so to speak. Otherwise, we would be somnolent and solipsistic. Somnolent and solipsistic as we settle back into supposed homeostasis. Yielding to the death drive that, after all, has its arms open for us, there to give us that final, tender embrace. In a recent visit to California, I was driven past an elementary school, private elementary school that parents pay for their children to enter. This one may have been expensive, may not, I have no idea. But outside there was a sign saying, "Educating the leaders of tomorrow." Since we have discussed the future in the past few minutes, I would like to speculate on who the leaders of tomorrow are likely to be. In this connection, let us examine just for a moment who the leaders of the world are today. They would appear to be largely politicians. For example, Joseph R. Biden, Barack Obama have been professional politicians throughout their lives. William Jefferson Clinton, although he had a few rather dubious business enterprises early in his life, was in fact groomed for political office by an organization, and after that he became nothing but a professional politician, and the same applies to his wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton. If one hops around the world, one can find similar situations. Professional politicians are the leaders of the world. Let's look at what professional politicians have gotten us into. In this connection, we are going to quote a couple of lines of dialogue from the motion picture JFK by Oliver Stone.
The organizing principle of any society, Mr. Garrison, is for war. The authority of the state over its people resides in its war powers.
As a final closing comment, I quote Bob Dylan. "Don't follow leaders, watch your parking meters." And now, as always on our show, Explore Redundant Epistemology, here is an excerpt from the book Against Epistemology by Theodor W. Adorno. Quote, "With the imposition of the persisting, das Bleibende, as the true, the onset of truth becomes the onset of deception. It is a fallacy that what persists is truer than what perishes. The order which remodels the world into disposable property is passed off as the world itself. The invariance of the concept, which would not be unless the temporal determinacy of what is grasped under concepts were ignored, is confused with the unchangeability of being in itself. The grotesque maneuver of that phenomenological practitioner who deals with what is called the problem of immortality in his jargon, by unblushingly acknowledging the destruction of every soul, but then consoling himself because the pure concept of every such soul, its individual ethos, is incorruptible. This helpless trick, which brings to light simply through its clumsiness what is hidden in the cavernous depths of great speculation. Heraclitus, whom Hegel and Nietzsche both praised, had already compared essence and the past. Ever since the first authentic formulation of the theory of ideas, the past has always been ascribed to appearance, the kingdom of doxa, and illusion. Infinity was reserved for essence. Only Nietzsche protested. Quote, "The other idiosyncrasy of the philosophers is no less dangerous. It consists in confusing the last and the first. They place what comes at the end, unfortunately, for it ought not to come at all, namely the highest concepts, which means the most general, the emptiest concepts, the last smoke of evaporating reality, in the beginning, as the beginning." Thanks for joining us once again for another episode of Explore Redundant Epistemology, coming to you live from the Nutty Pine Room of the Hotel Eisenhower in beautiful downtown Pensacola, Florida, where all of the children are below average and none of the women are attractive.